7,000 men, 12 miles of walls, an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years, reduced by the spring of 1453 to a single city surrounded on every side by the forces of Sultan Mehmed II. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos had sent letters to Venice, to Genoa, to the Pope, to the kings of Hungary and Aragon. He had accepted conditions he despised. He had agreed to a church union that his own people rioted against in the streets. He had done everything a sovereign could do to bring Christian Europe to his walls. The Venetian Senate was still deliberating when the city fell. The question that survives in every eyewitness account of those 53 days is not whether Constantinople could have been saved. It is why one man chose to stay and fight when every rational calculation and every diplomatic avenue told him to leave. How an emperor, who received almost no meaningful help from the world he had spent 4 years appealing to, held the most fortified city in the medieval world for 53 days, and why, on the morning of May 29, 1453, he removed his imperial insignia and walked into the final assault himself. By 1449, when Constantine XI ascended the Byzantine throne, the empire he inherited was not an empire in any meaningful territorial sense. Modern scholarship generally describes what remained as a city-state: Constantinople itself, a handful of Aegean islands, and the Peloponnese. The lands of Anatolia, which had once formed the agricultural and military backbone of Byzantine power, had been Ottoman territory for generations. The city's population had fallen from several hundred thousand in its peak centuries to somewhere between 40 and 50,000 by the mid-15th century. Large sections within the ancient walls had reverted to open fields. Multiple contemporary sources, including the eyewitness Chronicle of George Sphrantzes, Constantine's personal secretary, and the only Greek witness who left a written account, describe a capital that felt, in many respects, already hollowed out. What Constantine possessed was the Theodosian land walls, a triple-layered limestone fortification stretching approximately 6 kilometers from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, constructed in the 5th century and never successfully breached in over 1,000 years of siege attempts. Arab fleets had come and been turned back. Bulgarian armies had arrived and withdrawn. A crusader force in 1204 had taken the city not by breaking the walls, but by exploiting a moment of political collapse from within. An Ottoman siege in 1422, under Mehmed's father, Murad II, had been lifted. When internal revolts required the Sultan's attention elsewhere, the walls themselves were the city's argument for survival. Constantine understood, however, that walls alone were insufficient against what Mehmed II was assembling. The new Sultan, 21 years old when he came to power in 1451, had spent his first years in authority making one objective clear above all others: Constantinople would fall in his reign. Contemporary sources describe his preparations beginning almost immediately. A fortress, later known as Rumeli Hisari, was constructed on the European bank of the Bosphorus in 1452, cutting off Byzantine access to the Black Sea and its grain supply from the foundries of Edirne. A Hungarian engineer named Urban had designed and cast a bombard of a size that had no precedent in European siege warfare. Contemporary accounts describe the barrel at approximately 8 meters in length, capable of projecting stone shot of several hundred kilograms over a distance of more than a kilometer. The weapon required 60 oxen and several hundred men to move overland to the city walls. Against this, Constantine sent his letters. To Pope Nicholas V, he offered the one thing the papacy had demanded for decades: formal union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, which was proclaimed in the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia on December 12, 1452. The population of Constantinople, according to multiple accounts, reacted with outrage. Clergy refused to serve in churches that had accepted the Latin Rite. The phrase recorded by several contemporary observers, that the people preferred the turban of the Sultan to the tiara of the Pope, was not metaphor. It reflected a genuine theological and historical bitterness rooted in the sack of 1204, when Crusader forces had looted the city and installed a Latin emperor for 57 years. Constantine accepted the union nonetheless, understanding it as the price of Western military support. The support did not come. What made Constantine's diplomatic position structurally impossible, and what modern historians consistently emphasize, is that the problem was not merely Ottoman power. It was the timing and the politics of every potential ally simultaneously. France and England had spent over a century in a war with each other. That had formally ended only 2 years before the siege began. Spain was still engaged in the Reconquista. The Holy Roman Empire was divided by internal political instability. Hungary had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Varna in 1444, where a crusader force attempting to relieve pressure on Byzantine territories had been destroyed by Murad II, an event that, according to multiple contemporary accounts, had effectively broken the appetite of the Hungarian kingdom for further direct confrontation with Ottoman forces. Constantine was appealing to a Christian Europe that was exhausted, divided, and, in the case of Venice and Genoa, more interested in maintaining commercial arrangements with the Ottomans than in fighting them. The letters Constantine sent were answered with sympathy. Sympathy did not man the walls. Venice, whose merchant fleets depended on access to Byzantine and Eastern Mediterranean ports, debated the question at the level of its Senate. A fleet was authorized in February 1453. Modern historians generally note that the authorization came too late for the ships to be equipped, crewed, and sailed in time to assist before the siege began. Individual Venetians already present in Constantinople joined the defense, and the Senate authorized the commandeering of Venetian vessels in the Golden Horn for the city's use. The formal relief fleet that Constantine had been promised was still being organized when the walls fell. George Sphrantzes, writing about the failure of Western aid with the controlled bitterness of a man who had watched it unfold, recorded that Constantinople received from Rome approximately what the Sultan of Egypt had sent, which is to say, nothing of consequence. Genoa was more direct, if only marginally more effective. The city-state sent a professional soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who arrived in January 1453 with approximately 700 men, 400 recruited in Genoa itself, 300 from the Genoese-held island of Chios. Giustiniani was immediately appointed by Constantine to command the defense of the land walls, the most critical sector of the fortification. Multiple contemporary accounts, including those of Niccolò Barbaro, a Venetian nobleman who kept a day-by-day journal of the siege, and whom the historian Stephen Runciman later described as the most useful of the Western sources, agree that Giustiniani was an effective commander and that his presence was consequential. But 700 men, however professional, did not constitute the relief force that Constantine had requested. When added to every available Byzantine soldier, Venetian volunteer, Catalan, and other individual defenders, the total defending force numbered, according to Sphrantzes' own census, conducted at Constantine's order in the last weeks before the siege, approximately 4,773 Greeks and fewer than 3,000 foreigners. Modern historians generally accept a total somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 defenders along a perimeter of roughly 12 miles of walls. The Ottoman force that assembled outside those walls in April 1453 is more difficult to quantify precisely. Contemporary sources range widely. Sphrantzes himself, writing decades later, gave figures that modern historians regard as inflated. Modern scholarship generally places the Ottoman army at between 60,000 and 80,000 men, with some estimates for the total force, including irregular troops and support personnel, reaching higher. What is not disputed is the ratio. The defenders were outnumbered by at least 8 or 9 to 1 along a perimeter they could never fully man. The siege began formally on April 6, 1453, when the Great Bombard opened fire on the Theodosian walls at the section known as the Mesoteikion, a stretch of the fortification that ran through a small river valley where the walls were slightly lower than elsewhere, and where concentrated artillery fire from both sides of the depression could strike the same target. The cannon could fire only a small number of times per day. The stone shot it projected was heavy enough that each impact cracked and displaced sections of the outer wall. Contemporary accounts describe what became a pattern within the first week. Ottoman artillery would open breaches in the outer wall during the day, and the defenders, soldiers and civilians together, would spend the night filling those gaps with earth, timber, and rubble. By dawn, a rough repair would be in place. The bombardment would resume. There was one factor that sustained this pattern for 7 weeks, and that no Ottoman calculation had fully anticipated: Constantine XI himself. Multiple sources, including Niccolò Barbaro's journal and the later account of Leonard of Chios, a Genoese bishop who was present in the city and wrote a report to Pope Nicholas V shortly after The Fall agree that the emperor was present at the walls throughout the siege, moving between sectors, directing repairs, and fighting alongside the garrison. This was not ceremonial. He commanded at the point of greatest danger, the Mesoteikion. The sector targeted by the heaviest artillery and the most concentrated assaults was where Constantine personally stationed himself. The Venetian Senate's promised relief fleet remained the great psychological variable of the siege. Rumors of its imminent arrival circulated within the city and appear, paradoxically, to have had an effect on both sides. Contemporary accounts suggest that Mehmed, hearing the same rumors, accelerated his planning for a final assault partly out of concern that a Venetian fleet might still arrive. Inside the walls, the rumors provided weeks of hope that the documentary record cannot sustain. No substantial Venetian fleet arrived. 3 ships carrying grain, sent by Pope Nicholas V and described in several accounts as the only meaningful maritime supply that reached the city during the siege, broke through the Ottoman naval blockade on April 20th and entered the Golden Horn. Mehmed, according to multiple sources, was so enraged by his fleet's failure to stop them that he stripped his admiral of rank and ordered a public flogging. But 3 grain ships were not a fleet. The food situation inside Constantinople continued to worsen through May. On May 22nd, a lunar eclipse visible over the city was recorded by multiple eyewitnesses, including Barbaro. Contemporary Byzantine tradition held that the city stood under the protection of the Virgin Mary and that the moon was her symbol. The eclipse was read, in several accounts, as a sign of divine withdrawal. What the documentary record cannot establish is how widely this interpretation spread and whether it affected the defenders' performance in the final days. What it does establish is that by the last week of May, the population of Constantinople knew that no large force was coming, and that the Ottoman army had not broken, and was not going to break, under the defensive resistance. The re-hook that no account can avoid is what happened to Giustiniani on the night of May 28th into May 29th. Here the primary sources diverge sharply, and the divergence matters for understanding the final hours. Niccolò Barbaro, writing from the Venetian side, states that Giustiniani received a wound and chose to leave the walls and board a Genoese ship rather than remain at his post. Leonard of Chios confirms the wound, but describes it as having been caused by an arrow. The Greek historians Doukas and Launikos Chalkokondyles also report a wound. What is consistent across most accounts is that Giustiniani departed the wall sector he had been holding. What is disputed, and has remained disputed in modern scholarship, is whether the wound was incapacitating or whether the departure constituted an abandonment of the defense. At the critical moment, Barbaro blamed Giustiniani directly. Other contemporary accounts are more ambiguous. What is beyond dispute is the tactical consequence. When the Genoese commander left the Mesoteikion sector, the troops he had been leading withdrew after him, and Ottoman forces pushed through the gap before a coherent response could be organized. It was at this point, according to the convergent weight of contemporary accounts, that the city's defense effectively collapsed. Ottoman forces moved through the breach and began to appear inside the outer walls. The Kirkoporta, a small postern gate in the northern section of the fortification, had, according to several accounts, been left unlatched during a sortie and not secured again before the final assault began. Ottoman troops found it open and poured through. The sequence of these 2 failures, the collapse at the Mesoteikion and the unsecured gate, is what modern historians generally identify as the operational mechanism of the fall. Neither required genius to exploit. Both required the defenders to be stretched thin enough that a single point of failure could cascade across the whole. Constantine XI's last movements are the most contested element of the entire siege. No reliable eyewitness account records exactly what he did in the final minutes. George Sphrantzes, who was himself in another sector of the fighting, states only that the emperor was killed. Leonard of Chios gives a different account in which Constantine, realizing the city was lost, appealed to those around him to end his life rather than see him taken captive. A request, Leonard says, that no one fulfilled. The Venetian Barbaro notes that he could not confirm whether the emperor had died or escaped alive, though he adds that some reported seeing a body among the fallen. The most widely recorded detail, that Constantine removed his imperial insignia before entering the final assault so that he would not be identified by the enemy, is reported in several sources, though the circumstances described differ between them. What the sources agree on is that after May 29th, 1453, Constantine XI Palaiologos was never seen again. His grave has never been found. The Palaiologan state ceased to exist on the day the city fell. His brothers retained control of the Peloponnese for a few years longer, but Ottoman forces absorbed those territories by 1460. The political consequences of the fall spread across Europe at the speed of ships. Pope Nicholas V, who had spent months being told his aid was critical and had sent grain ships and promises instead of fleets, called for a new crusade to recover the city. No European monarch volunteered. The shock was genuine. Multiple European courts had not fully expected the city to fall. A wall that had held for over 1,000 years against every previous challenger had created a kind of confidence that had become a substitute for preparation. The fall of Constantinople was, in the assessment of several modern historians, the most predictable major catastrophe in late medieval Europe that the affected parties had done the least to prevent. The trading cities of Venice and Genoa immediately began calculating how to maintain commercial relations with the new Ottoman masters of Constantinople. The scholars and clergy who fled the city westward, carrying manuscripts, knowledge of Greek, and the accumulated intellectual inheritance of 14 centuries of Roman continuity, dispersed into the Italian city-states and contributed to the body of recovered classical learning that modern historians associate with the Renaissance. The Orthodox Church survived under Ottoman protection. Mehmed II appointed a new patriarch and allowed religious practice to continue, understanding that a functioning religious hierarchy was administratively useful. The last imperial dynasty had ended. The institution it had served for over 1,000 years had not. The church union that Constantine had proclaimed in Hagia Sophia on December 12, 1452, the price he paid for the help that never came, was rendered moot on May 29, 1453, when Mehmed II entered the same cathedral and ordered the first Muslim prayer offered within its walls. Hagia Sophia became a mosque. Constantine's gamble, the sacrifice of Orthodox unity for Western military support, had purchased nothing. George Sphrantzes, who survived the siege, was enslaved, ransomed, and eventually retired to a monastery where he wrote his Chronicle. He recorded the census he had conducted for Constantine, 4,773 Greek defenders, as the single most telling number of the siege. Not the size of the Ottoman army, not the weight of the cannon shot, the number of men an emperor had to work with while the rest of the world finished its own wars. Constantine XI had been offered the alternative. Before the siege began, Mehmed sent terms. Surrender the city, and the emperor's life would be spared. He would be given the Peloponnese to govern. His people would not be harmed. Constantine refused. The refusal is preserved in multiple accounts. George Sphrantzes recorded the substance of it, that the city was not Constantine's to surrender because it belonged to every person living within it, all of whom had already resolved to die rather than hand it over. Whether those exact words were spoken in that form, modern historians cannot confirm. What is confirmed is that Constantine stayed, that he fought, and that when the Ottoman army breached the walls of the city his family had ruled for over a century, the last Roman emperor took off his crown and walked toward the fighting. No one found him afterward. This was Imperion archive, where the past still rides.